Hey everyone, I'm Eduardo Norette. Thanks for coming to my channel, for watching this video. As always, if you like what you see, please give this video a like and don't forget to give my channel a subscribe. This is the second video in my News Explained series where I'm going to try to spend a little more time on some topics and stories that maybe you have missed, maybe the media underreported it or they didn't cover it in depth enough, just something that I think is worth a little more conversation. So without further ado, episode 2. Let's get started. First up, Joe Biden's farewell address to the nation that was all over the news this week. It's not that it was undercovered, but I think the corporate media, what they didn't do enough at least, is take one last look, one last objective look at Joe Biden's presidency. And that's because they know any assessment over his record on the last 4 years would conclude that his presidency was an abject failure. And all I have to do is point to two issues, inflation and immigration. So number one on inflation, when Joe Biden took office, inflation was less than 2%. By the end of his first year in office, December 2021, inflation had skyrocketed to 7%, which was the highest number since 1982. 6 months later, prices were up 9%. Again, and that was on top of the increases from the year prior because, of course, inflation is compounding. Many of you know this because you felt it in your pockets, you felt it in everything you were buying, from gas to groceries. By spring of this year, prices had increased by over 20% since Biden took office. Groceries up 22%. So that means anything that cost you about $100 before Biden took office then had the same buying power as $120 does today. Your $100 went further under Trump than it did now, or it still does, under Biden. And that's what most in the media failed to report about Biden's presidency, the issue of inflation and how it hurt Americans. Especially towards the end, you had members of the media, you had people like Joe Scarborough, you had Democrat allies, deceptively implying that prices were coming down because the rate of inflation was coming down. You would hear them say, well, inflation is down to 3%, and speaking to the audiences as if that meant that prices were coming down too. But of course, that's not how it works. If prices go up 7% in the first year, and then another 9% on top of that, that means prices are continuing to go up. It doesn't matter if inflation is now down to 3%. Prices are still going up. It just means that they are rising slower than they were before. Not that prices are coming down. And of course, your wages haven't risen with inflation either. I mean, no one has gotten a free 20% raise to keep up with Joe Biden's inflation. And the worst part of all of this is it will be almost impossible to bring these prices down, mainly because there are now much more dollars in circulation. In Biden's first 2 years in office, he increased the M2 money supply, which is a measure of the supply of money. It includes things like cash, money market funds, etc. He increased the supply of that measure of money by over 40%. And so that is the top of Joe Biden's legacy. And then the second, I really don't have to go into that much because by now it has been drilled in the minds of the American people. They have seen it for 4 years, is the issue of immigration. And when he took over from Trump, he and the Democrats pledged to reverse Trump's racist immigration policies, his unwelcoming immigration policies. They said they were going to open the borders to the world. In fact, before Biden got elected, he told people from around the world to come in. And that's exactly what happened. 4 years later, there have been more than 12 million illegal border crossers. That doesn't even include the number that were able to evade Border Patrol. And that doesn't even include the hundreds of thousands that Biden actually flew in on charter and commercial flights. So imagine that, inviting people from the third world whose identities we don't know and paying for their flights to come here from anywhere they want. We saw this in cities across the country like New York, Chicago. Many of these cities were overwhelmed. They could not handle the influx of all these new people. And yet, cities like New York, which have some of the highest taxes in the country, they were offering things like free hotel rooms, free food, free debit cards to these migrants. So most people don't have to get a lecture on why this hurt the country. But I think the simple point is, if you can encapsulate it in one sentence, is you can't import millions of poor, lower skilled immigrants who don't even speak the language and expect them to function or understand how our society works. Aside from the fact of how chaotic it is, many of these immigrants from Latin America even lack a basic education. They can hardly even read or write in their own language sometimes. So what ends up happening? We end up taking care of them. We provide healthcare, housing, food. Their kids get to attend public school for free, even though they don't pay taxes. And across the country, in localities, states, even the federal government, it has cost the taxpayers billions of dollars. And this, that's not even touching the crime issue, which is a very real issue. Just ask the family of Laken Riley and many, many others who have had people victimized, slaughtered, killed by illegal immigrants. And so that is what Joe Biden has done to the United States with his violent, reckless immigration policy. Okay, I want to take a few minutes here to dive into an interesting debate that was raging on X. So if you're not on the platform, you probably didn't even see or hear about this, which is kind of why I want to talk about it. It's something different. It's something you may not have heard yet. But I also think it's an interesting divide that many of us may be experiencing, in our family lives, kind of a debate across generations. So a few days ago, Chris Rufo, some of you may be familiar with him. He's an activist and a journalist. He's done a lot of good work exposing DEI and critical race theory in our institutions like college campuses and corporations. Anyway, he had gotten into an exchange with one of his followers on X on the state of the US economy, and his follower had replied to one of his posts about the economy, and the follower was basically challenging Rufo on how good the economy currently was. And so in replying to this follower, Rufo was basically making the case that the US economy is in good shape, and the reason for that is because the Panda Express in his neighborhood is offering $70,000 a year to be some assistant manager or something, and the Chipotle is paying $100,000 a year to be a store manager. So that statement, using Panda Express and Chipotle as an economic metric, caused an online uproar amongst younger and Gen Z millennial conservatives. And so I'm not really going to get into the exact responses. It's not about who said what or what was specifically said. It's more about the themes and the arguments that kind of unfolded online here. Younger conservatives were basically arguing that at a time when young males are struggling in this country, when they're falling behind in education, falling behind economically, telling them to go work at Panda Express isn't exactly a solution to their problems. Many of them were saying, Chipotle, store manager, that's really not the career or future that I was promised or that I was hoping for. And then those sentiments were interpreted by older baby boomer conservatives, prominent ones like people like Matt Walsh, Mike Cernovich, and others, as typical younger entitlement mentality. Snobbery, this idea that, I'm above doing certain type of jobs. They didn't take too kindly to that. And there was certainly some of that there, but I think the younger Americans are right on a couple of fronts. Number one is, if you have a college degree, by definition, there are some jobs that are beneath your skill and intelligence level. That doesn't mean there isn't some value in taking these jobs, especially earlier in your career. They build character, maybe they help you pay your way through school, maybe it's a transitional thing. But are these the types of jobs we're supposed to be pushing on younger men in their mid to late 20s who are educated, who are trying to grow in their careers and start families? Some boomers responded to this by saying, well, I worked really hard in my career to get ahead, suck it up. We all had to do crappy jobs coming out of school. And then they cite their examples of how they made 20 or 30 grand in the 80s, as if that's anywhere close to maybe someone who's making 45 or 50 entry level today. Because look, if you made 30 grand in 1985, adjusted for inflation, that's almost 90 grand today. And guess what? That figure doesn't even account for increased costs, things that have risen above the rate of inflation, things like education and housing. As my friend Pedro Gonzalez pointed out in his Substack, according to a recent study in Consumer Affairs, Gen Z Americans have 86% less purchasing power than boomers did in their 20s. The study also found that, quote, in today's dollars, Gen Zers and millennials are paying nearly 100% more on average for their homes compared to what boomers paid. Similarly, according to the National Center for Education Statistics, public school tuition has increased by more than 2,500% since 1970. So, newsflash to a lot of these boomers who are financially successful today. Did you work hard? Of course. You should, and many of you have been, rewarded for that. Nobody's trying to take that away from you. But guess what? You were also lucky. Maybe you were lucky personally, but all of you, or most of you, were definitely lucky to live in an economy that was vastly different than what it is today. You were lucky to live in a time when the median home price was only 3 times the median salary in this country. According to some metrics, today it's over 7. And it reached a record high 2 years ago in 2022. Earlier this year, a report from Clever Real Estate also found that home prices rose at more than double the pace of inflation has risen since the 1960s. According to the Federal Reserve data, since 1985, home prices have also risen much faster, almost double the rate that median household incomes rose in that same time span. So if you're arguing, for example, as Matt Walsh did, and by the way, I like Matt Walsh, I'm just using him as an example, but if you're arguing like he did that, I made 17 grand a year in my first job, these Gen Zers are complaining about being able to make much more than that, they have no right, or they don't know what it's like. If you're saying that without considering how much expensive everything else has gotten, you're a little out of touch, you're delusional. Again, simple math says 50, 60, 70 grand today on, when you look at it on paper, literally speaking, is more than 20 or 30 grand a couple decades ago. But that doesn't mean someone is better off today than you would have been back then. I mean, if you can't understand the basic metrics that I pointed out, like inflation, price increases, and all of those increases when compared to wage growth, then you're not looking at the situation accurately. I mean, sure, kids these days are making more money, okay? But what can they do with that money? They can't even afford to have families, to buy a home. More and more young Americans are living at home with their parents and their families. Nearly 50% actually of Americans aged 18 to 29. That's the highest number since the 1940s. And so do these baby boomers really think that that's a choice, that these 18 to 29-year-olds are all, half of them are all living at home because they want to? So again, not taking anything away from the boomer generation, they have been very successful. It has been a lot because of hard work. I'm happy for their success. I mean, if your parents or your grandparents are baby boomers, you have likely benefited from their financial success. But at the same time, it's fair to say you're not a genius just because you bought a home for $120,000 in the 1990s that's now worth $1 million. You're not a genius because you went to college when tuition is a fraction of what it is today, or because you could actually pay your way through school back then. That doesn't make you smarter or more financially responsible. But on the flip side, I do want to say these older conservatives have a point in that there is nothing and should be nothing wrong with any type of job that allows someone to provide for themselves and their families. My grandfather used to say that all the time. He said, there's no shame in earning an honest living. But there's a difference in telling someone with a high school education or lower, go work at Chipotle or Panda Express. That's fine. And that could be a very nice life to a lot of people. But there's a difference in saying that to them versus telling that to someone with a college degree or someone who has exhibited a level of intellect or talent that would be put to waste in a working class job. This debate is really similar to something else that I've seen percolating on the right for a couple of years, which is the idea of rejecting high status institutions and careers. The right has become more populist in the last few years under Donald Trump. A lot of people have celebrated that. A lot of people have made the party's messaging more populist. But I don't know if that's been the smartest thing to younger Americans in the party. You hear conservative organizations telling young Americans to skip college because they'll get brainwashed, you'll get indoctrinated, it's too much money. These conservatives will say, well, instead you should learn a trade, or you should take a working class job that will pay okay and won't have a lot of growth financial, year over year, but it'll maybe give you a stable career. I think that's counterproductive. I mean, number one, if you come from a lower or middle class background, maybe your parents didn't go to college, and if you're actually capable and intelligent, why the hell would anyone tell someone in that situation not to get educated? I mean, that's reverse advancement of oneself. That's negative growth. How are you going to tell a smart kid from the inner city or middle America not to go to school? Because to that kid, getting educated might be the best shot out for them, for financial success, for leaving the trauma of growing up poor or growing up in a household that didn't have a lot of prospects. I mean, think of someone like J.D. Vance. That's someone who comes to mind for me. Neither his mother nor his grandmother went to college. He didn't have a father in the home. His family was plagued by drug addiction, and there were some violent episodes if you read his book or watched the movie. And so would any of us with a straight face tell a kid in J.D. Vance's shoes and say to them, don't go to college, J.D. Don't go to Ohio State University. Definitely don't go to Yale Law School. That's for the left. They'll indoctrinate you there. They're going to brainwash you there. You should just go and take that factory job. Is that really what we would say? Because JD wouldn't be where he is today had he not tried to seek advancement, if he had not tried to better himself by attending these higher education institutions. From the viewpoint of the broader political movement, I mean, again, I don't understand why we as conservatives would allow ourselves to cede these powerful institutions to the left. I mean, yeah, let's just tell conservatives not to go to college. That way it'll be leftists who are the ones who'll get educated. We'll let the leftists be the ones to go to law school. That way they'll be the attorneys, they'll be the judges. We'll let leftists become doctors. Let's let them control Wall Street. You don't want to go there because Wall Street's woke, right? Don't go to Wall Street. Let's let the left control elected government too. Let's let them be the elitists while the rest of us work in restaurant and service jobs. I mean, do they see how dumb this sounds? How would that benefit any of us as a movement? I wonder how many of these people, by the way, like Chris Rufo, also would tell their own kids to skip elite institutions in favor of Chipotle and Panda Express. Again, I'm not attacking Chris Rufo. I like him. I think he's done amazing work. But Chris Rufo went to Georgetown and Harvard. So it's a bit rich when these people who have had access to elites and the most elite institutions in our country and come out of those, and I would say those elite institutions attributed to their success, it's a bit rich when they turn around and tell the rest of us to avoid it. And again, I get it. This isn't to say that everyone should go to college. I get where those arguments against college come from. It is too expensive. The system is wasteful. And a lot of kids, it's true, they have no business taking out hundreds of thousands of dollars for degrees that are going to put them in a hole when they graduate, or degrees that will not help them ever pay that back. I agree with all of that. But at the same time, we have to, come back to reality here. Not every kid is a Charlie Kirk. Charlie Kirk didn't go to college. He built a very influential organization, and he's likely a millionaire. But not everyone who doesn't go to school is going to turn out like he did. So the solution is, let's not tell an entire generation of youth to turn their back from higher education. How about you fix the problems with it instead of ceding that institution and others to the left? I mean, again, don't tell an entire generation to aspire to be less educated than the one that preceded it. It's so moronic. I can't believe this is really what some people are arguing. It's self-defeating. Last thing I'll say on this, because it needs to be said, the most talented and the smartest among us in society should aspire to high status jobs. They shouldn't be ashamed to want to have access to these elite institutions or elite careers. It is okay for them to reject and to want to reject lower status jobs in pursuit of that goal. And it's not about money, it's about status. Status matters in life. It affects the friends we keep from the women we attract. Again, I didn't make it that way. I didn't write the rules, but that's how Western civilization has worked for hundreds of years. I mean, think of all the recent trends about young men and the decline in marriage rates. Many of the same people now saying, just go work at Panda Express, go work at Chipotle. They can't see how that would affect what status and what type of woman that someone would settle down with. I mean, if she had the choice, for example, do you really think a high-value woman would settle for someone with a working-class job or a white-collar job if she had the choice and if most other things were equal? If both men were decent guys, good moral guys, which would she choose? Again, I'm not saying she should choose one or the other. This is just a fact of life. That's how things are. You think you want to disagree with me? Think I'm being elitist? How many of you would tell your own children and grandchildren that you want them to be lesser than you were? Isn't upward mobility the goal for each of us and our families? I mean, honestly, does anyone aspire to downward mobility in society? Studies have shown that downward mobility is associated with increased drug use, suicide, depression, other mental health struggles. And so again, it's not to say that there's anything wrong with any type of job, especially for people who didn't go to college and maybe you didn't want a professional career, but that was your choice. There's a difference in you choosing that versus maybe the elite among us in society or those of us with huge platforms telling young people and trying to influence them into some of these choices. And I think the most obvious giveaway in the boomer argument is this. Many of them say, well, how dare you look down on restaurant or service or working class jobs? They cite their own experience as an example. They say, well, my first job was in a restaurant, or I was a busboy when I was 17. I had a job that I hated out of school. And they're sort of telling on themselves. I mean, you're sort of admitting there that these were jobs that were primarily, or at least used to be, for students and for teenagers as first jobs. They weren't meant to be careers to support families. And yet now that's the exact argument that they're pushing on young Americans. They're using the fact that they had these jobs when they were 14, 15, or 16 as an excuse why you should have it at age 25, 26, 27. It's a joke. The fact is, there is value in achieving and reaching your fullest potential. And for many people, that isn't going to be met working at a Panda Express. And for others, that means not going to college, and that's okay, I get it. But we shouldn't push otherwise talented people to careers that are beneath their education and their intellect level. It's that simple. All right, that's about it for me this week. Thanks again for watching. Don't forget to give this video a like, and please give my channel a subscribe before you go. We'll see you next time.